Now imagine, think of how much stuff we produce as Americans working 40 hours a week. It's almost unbelievable. The United States is such an unbelievably productive country that one is just staggered by it. In the 1920s, the United States was so productive that it was producing 34% of all the production in the whole world in one country. Amazing. Well, today we produce tremendous abundance. I mean, like every other person's got a laptop, a cell phone. A cell phone, the greatest king of Europe 2 centuries ago couldn't have dreamed of such a thing. People have got, everybody has a laptop. People have DVD players on their laptops. That's not enough for some people. Look at this and that. It's unbelievable. We don't even think about this. We think, oh, of course that's the way it is. Well, we can produce a tremendous amount, and we all roughly work 40 hours a week. Now, I know some people work 60, some people work 80. But let's, for the sake of argument, say we work 40 hours a week. But now suppose we have that economy with no machines in it. And we all say, well, you know what, we got no machines. They were all wiped out in a big accident. Somebody accidentally burned all the machines. But we're going to keep working just 40 hours a week. What would happen if you worked 40 hours a week and you had no machines to help you work? You would produce almost nothing compared to what we produce now. There would be whole classes of goods you could not produce at all, and other goods you could produce only in the smallest quantities. So if you worked 40 hours a week under that economy, it would be pathetic. You would never produce the kind of goods people need. A lot of people would just die, basically. You could never support this population. So now, why do I bring up this example? I mean, it's obvious, right? I mean, no one would dispute that. That if you have no machines, you're not going to be able to produce very much, producing everything with your bare hands. Well, now let's think of what life was like in the 18th century. Now, it's true, you had some primitive, simple machines in the 18th century, but they were primitive compared to what we have now. We would consider them clumsy and almost absurd. Now, we're told that the reason people in the 18th century had low wages was that wicked businessmen were just keeping the wages down. That's why people couldn't buy that many things, because evil businessmen were conspiring against them. Well, now think of it in terms of the experiment we just thought of, where you have no machines. That's basically the world they lived in, what we would consider a nightmare, where you have no electricity, no machines, nothing. Everything is either produced by hand or with the most clumsy contraption. We all know we could produce very little. We would all have to work 100 hours a week to barely survive. Well, that's what they lived in. That's why they all worked so hard. Because if they hadn't, they wouldn't have been able to produce anywhere near the amount of goods people needed to live. It isn't that big businessmen were secretly keeping all the television sets from people. They couldn't produce these things. They couldn't produce in abundance because they didn't have the technology and the capital investment to do so. So that, and I mention that as a thought experiment, because now we see how the market makes us better off. Because what happens in the free market? Businessmen take their profits, and if they want to continue to prosper, they can't just go out and blow it on vacations and statues of themselves all day. They have to take most of their profits and reinvest them in the business to buy steam shovels and forklifts and assembly line equipment and capital equipment so as to be able to produce more and more goods. Well, when businesses do that, they make it possible to produce more and more goods with fewer and fewer hands. And so we can produce in greater and greater and greater abundance. And so now we have an economy that can produce, instead of just a few goods, with everybody working 100 hours a week, we can barely produce a few goods because we're all producing everything by hand. Now what we produce with all this sophisticated equipment, we don't have to all work 100 hours a week anymore. We can earn enough to survive on working fewer hours. Because we produce in such abundance that we find lower and lower prices for all the goods we buy. And so our wages go further, they stretch further. And so we become wealthier. Our real wages increase because the capital equipment produces more goods, so we have more goods in ratio against number of people, and we have the prices go down. That's why things have improved. Now, it's true, we don't see most prices go down. Most things seem to go up, other than computers and whatever. Most things seem to go up. But that's because we have a Federal Reserve System that always increases the money supply. The point is that when prices go up less rapidly than wages, we still see the effect that I've described in our economy. That's why we're doing better, is because of capital investments, not because the government loots people to give to you. There's only so much that can be looted in the 18th century. And so I can't help mentioning George Reisman's statement. He says that the workers of the early 19th century did not lack automobiles and television sets because the capitalists were keeping the whole supply to themselves. There simply were no automobiles or television sets for anyone. Nor did the workers of those days lack sufficient housing, clothing, and meat because the capitalists had too much of these goods. Very little of such goods could be produced when they had to be produced almost entirely by hand. If the limited supplies of such goods that the capitalists had could have been redistributed, the improvement in the conditions of the workers would hardly have been noticeable. If 1 person in 1,000, say, is a wealthy capitalist and eats twice as much and has 20 times the clothing and furniture as an average person, hardly any noticeable improvement for the average person could come from dividing the capitalist's consumption by 999 and redistributing it. And beyond that, if you do that, you just tax all this stuff away from the wealthy, then they're just not going to engage in this investment in the first place. They're not going to buy all this equipment. Because if they know that the fruits of it are going to be taxed away, they won't bother investing in it. We won't be able to produce as much, and we'll be poor once again. Now, we can see this effect in this way in our economy. We can see that Americans today need to work far fewer hours to earn the purchasing power necessary to buy goods than they had to in the past. So, for instance, if you wanted to buy a loaf of bread in 1950, you would have had to work 6 minutes to earn the money necessary to do that. But thanks to improvements in efficiency and supply and so on and so forth, by 1999 it was just 3.5 minutes you had to work to make the money necessary to buy a loaf of bread. In 1950, you want to buy a dozen oranges, it'll take you 20 minutes to earn the money you need to do that. By 1999, it was only 9 minutes. If you want 100 kilowatts of electricity, someone in 1950 would have had to work for 2 hours. In 1999, the same person would have had to work only 14 minutes. If you want to make a coast-to-coast telephone call for 3 minutes, in 1950 you would have had to work for 104 minutes. That would have been a fun call. Okay, I have to hurry up and say this because it took me 104 minutes to get the money to buy this call. 1999, 2 minutes of work, and you got that phone call. Now, there's nothing automatic about this. It's not like, well, this is just the way the world is. It works because you have a market system, and businesses, more or less at least, can profit from investing in equipment that is more efficient and produces more. If you want to abolish this prosperity, then just tax all that away. Now, these statistics are even more dramatic if we start with the year 1900. So let's say you want to buy a pair of jeans. In 1900, you would have had to work 9 hours on average to make the money to buy them. 4 hours in 1950 and only 3 in 1999. But suppose you say, I don't want a pair of jeans, I want a 3-pound chicken. Well, I have the statistics for that too. A worker in 1900 would have had to work for 160 minutes. That's 2 hours and 40 minutes for a rotten 3-pound chicken. In 1950, you would have had to work 71 minutes. In 1999, 24 minutes. In 1908, it took the average American 2 years to earn the money to buy a car. My friend Tom DiLorenzo points out that today, a Ford Taurus costs an American worker about 8 months of labor, but the car is a technological miracle compared with the cars of yesteryear, with standard air conditioning, power seats, safety devices of all kinds, cruise control, a sunroof, tinted glass, a CD player, and so on. So, what have I tried to show up to this point? That the market has led to improved living standards, and of its very nature must do so. And, as we've seen, at the same time, it limits mankind's predatory instincts. You can't just loot your neighbor, you have to produce something.